Hello and welcome to podcast.init, the podcast about Python and the people who make it great. When you're ready to launch your next project, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so you should check out Linode at podcastinit.com/Linode and get a $20 credit to try out their fast and reliable Linux virtual servers for running your app. And now you can deliver your work to your users even faster with the newly upgraded 200 gigabit network in all of their data centers. If you're tired of cobbling together your deployment pipeline, then it's time to try out GoCD, the open source continuous delivery platform built by the people at ThoughtWorks who wrote the book about it. With GoCD, you get complete visibility into the life cycle of your software from one location. To download it now, go to podcastinit.com/GoCD. Professional support and enterprise plugins are available for added peace of mind. You can visit the site at podcastinit.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the newsletter, and read the show notes. And if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, I would love to hear them. Your host as usual is Tobias Macy, and today I'm interviewing Adrian Sampson about Beets, the Swiss Army knife for managing your music library. So Adrian, could you start by introducing yourself?
Absolutely. My name is Adrian Sampson. I am the progenitor of Beets, and I continue to work on maintaining it. There are so many other people involved now that I can't claim to own Beets, but I'm happy to represent it on a podcast.
And do you remember how you first got introduced to Python?
I think so. I think I was in high school, and friends were trying to get me to use Python instead of, I guess C++ was what I was using. And I remember it seemed, I remember being entirely put off by the white space significant syntax at the time because I was in high school and I didn't know better. And it was only through enough wearing down of people trying to get me to try it over and over again that I eventually found it and embraced it, and it became like my programming language of choice for years to come.
And you mentioned that you're the initial creator of Beets, so I'm wondering if you can describe what your motivation was for creating it in the first place and what the project is and what it might be used for.
Yes. My original intent with creating Beets was to have kind of a platform for doing interesting things with your music. Like, for example, I had a collection of MP3s that I've gotten from various places that are ripped from CDs, borrowed from friends, this type of thing. And I had no idea which of these were of an acceptable bitrate that I would actually want to listen to, which of them had been like cobbled around from various sources, and I should definitely replace by buying new MP3s from Amazon or something. And I realized I had no way of keeping track of this. I was essentially managing everything by hand. So the original intent was to have a kind of general system that I could keep my music tracked in one database and then essentially do whatever I wanted with it. That I could apply title case correction, that I could find bad music in my library and root it out, that I could, get the names of artists that were kind of hard to get right correct once and for all and make sure that they all showed up under one folder rather than just having this messy thing that I could manage essentially by hand. I guess going back even earlier than that, I found myself spending, and I think a lot of people do this, spending a huge amount of time in iTunes manually correcting tags. Like, I found it kind of a calming ritual to sit there and look over all my music and one by one make sure that all the articles in the middle of a title are lowercased, for example. Make sure that the thes and ands are all lowercased, which sounds, I know, incredibly exciting. And I found myself like really getting a lot out of this, that I really liked sort of being intimately involved with my music and getting every last detail correct. But it occurred to me that there was no reason to be essentially running a script manually to do this. And I wish for some sort of an abstraction to build on to apply all the kinds of changes that I wanted to do. There's like a little bit of scriptability in iTunes, but I really wanted something that I could make my own.
And when you were creating it, I'm assuming that the primary reason for using Python to implement it is because of your affinity for it as a programming language. But was there anything else about Python in particular that was conducive to this type of project? And if you were to start it over today, do you think you would make the same choice of language?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of specific things that made it the right language. One was Python's built-in SQLite library, which sounds like a small thing, but was incredibly huge. It's a really easy-to-use, well-designed library for interacting with SQLite databases, and I knew I wanted to use a SQLite database to track music. So using the SQLite 3 library was a really easy way to get started with a table, with two tables. One that was just a big list of all the tracks on my system, and one was a big list of all the albums that they were grouped together. And I could very easily get started without being a database expert. The second thing was an existing library for manipulating tags for multiple audio formats that's called Mutagen that we still use to this day. It's a really excellent battle-tested library for reading and writing, not just ID3 tags on MP3s, but a whole wide range of different files. And I don't know of any equivalent like Mutagen in any other language. So even if I didn't like Python, I still might pick Python because Mutagen is so good.
And so, as you mentioned, one of the primary use cases for Beets is to make sure that your music library has some sort of internal consistency, whatever the particular user might choose for enforcing. And just as a general overview of what a workflow would look like, if I have a large directory with a lot of subfolders and inconsistent naming conventions, there might be some random folders that just have a dumping of MP3s from multiple artists, multiple albums. What would the workflow look like for using Beets to bring that into some form of consistent organizational hierarchy?
Great question. So the way that Beets works is it wants to kind of control your entire music library, which means that it wants to have a directory that thinks of as where the clean Beets tracked music library lives. So the way that you usually do this is you set up Beets, install it with pip, do a little bit of configuration to get the file name structure exactly how you like. But you pick a new empty directory that will be the new clean music directory, and you keep that separate from where your current MP3s live. And then you run an importer command. So Beets thinks of cleaning your tags and getting them organized, not just as an act of moving files around, but importing them from the external unorganized world into the clean, organized Beets world, where file names are tracked by the database and everything is vetted to be correct. So what you do is after you're done configuring it, you run a beet import command on the directory containing all your old music. And then it goes through album by album, discovering individual albums and matching them against the MusicBrainz database, which contains high-quality metadata for most music in the world, and proposes corrections to you. And then you, the user, get to say yes or no, or you can manually correct the tags. And then when you're done, Beets will move them over into your cleaned music directory. It does this in what I think is a fairly involved way. I can't pretend that it's a simple system to interact with when doing this importing, because it sort of takes the philosophy that you want to be in complete control over exactly what happens to your music. So it will tell you exactly what it's changing on every single field and exactly where it's moving files from one point to another.
So I can definitely see that as being quite a verbose output when you're actually interacting with it. But as you said, the type of person who's most likely going to want to use this is the kind of person who wants to see all of that detail and make sure that nothing is going to be accidentally mangled and put into some format that they weren't intending.
Right. I guess we have our target market, and it's music nerds who really care about every single detail.
And in terms of the internal architecture, is there anything in particular that you've done as far as maybe using asynchronous tasks or multi-threading to allow for speeding up the overall processing speed because of the fact that it's so I/O intensive with moving those files around and manipulating the metadata? And how has that overall architecture evolved from the time that you first began working on it?
Yes, that is a good point. The original version of Beets was not multi-threaded, and this is maybe one of the biggest architectural changes that we made, is after the first version. To be specific, here is the problem with the original version of Beets as I first made it. It would read one album, it would communicate with the MusicBrainz servers to match it with an amount of metadata, and then it would want to interact with you to confirm those changes. So it would show you the proposed changes, then it would ask you to accept or reject them, and you'd be sitting at a command line prompt, ready to say yes or no, and Beets would be completely stuck. Beets wouldn't be doing anything else in the background. And of course, it would be much better if you could be, off making a cup of coffee or doing something else and just have Beets run ahead and look at hundreds of albums into the future, read those files from disk, go off to MusicBrainz, do its own computation, and come up with proposals for you, so that later when you come back and you're enjoying your cup of coffee, you can make a bunch of decisions in a row without waiting for Beets to progress. So that's what the major architectural change was to the importer, and we're still around with this same design today. And it works like a pipeline. So the idea is that you can visualize every single album that is imported into Beets going through a series of stages from left to right. And somewhere in the middle, there's interacting with the user. So albums can come in from the left, go through a few stages, communicating with MusicBrainz, reading files off the disk, doing Beets' computation. And they sort of pile up in a stack right before the stage where they have to interact with the user. And this can all happen concurrently. So you can be waiting there for hours, say, and albums will continue to pile up. And you can come along and interact with those in one big batch. And the reason I think this is nice, it doesn't just make it faster end to end to deal with your albums. It does make it faster because you can overlap the communication with the MusicBrainz with the reading and writing on the disk, for example. But it changes entirely the way that you interact with Beets. That is, you don't just have to sit there and wait for it to do its thing and then make one decision. Wait for it to do its thing and make one decision. Now, kind of the recommended way of dealing with Beets is to let it run for a really long time and then come and make all your decisions at once, which is completely different. And it's thanks to this architectural change.
Yeah, that definitely sounds like a much better user experience. And I'm wondering if you've seen any increase in usage because of those changes, of where before it may have been a much more dedicated type of person who would sit there and wait and interact stepwise with the program to ensure that every album is being processed, whereas by allowing somebody to just fire and forget for a while and then come back and do a batch operation in a much shorter time period, it may make it more likely for a more average music user to actually put in that time investment without having to be as deeply engaged with the program as it runs.
That's totally true. I remember so many IRC posts and mailing list posts in the early days of Beets that just like, this does not make sense to me. I can't see how anyone would ever use this tool. Like I get being nerdy about your music, but I just can't imagine sitting here for hours and hours. Even so, we get people like even though we try to explain this clearly in the documentation, we get people sending mailing list messages that believe it still works the old way. Essentially, they assume that you just have to sit there and wait for Beets to do its thing, and we have to patiently explain it. So, of course, even after changing the architecture, people are still confused, which means that it's really important we did make the change.
And one of the things that is interesting too about the use case and target market of Beets is that, maybe 5-10 years ago, it was much more common for somebody to have a large library of MP3s because that was essentially the only way that you could have a quantity of music that you could listen to. Whereas now, with the prevalence of streaming services and the increasing number of people who are using those types of services, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the need for managing a local digital music library as opposed to just tapping into one of those streaming services and taking advantage of the capabilities that those provide.
That is a really good question. This is actually something I think about a lot because Beets was made for an era where you manage your MP3s. And it seems like in some way that era might be coming to an end when people just don't want to deal with the hassle of tracking their own files. And so I can sort of see two ways forward for Beets, and it's going to become obvious which of them I prefer. One of them is for Beets to sort of maintain its original intent, that is to essentially to cater to people who still like to have one copy of their music on one machine and to organize it meticulously and just listen to it there. Like pretty much the same as we've been doing for a couple of decades now. People who have been dedicatedly ripping their CDs or downloading MP3s from DRM-free sources and just maintaining their own music library in one place. The second is to embrace the fact that people do like some advantages of streaming, but to also acknowledge at the same time that we don't have to give up the idea of owning our own music to make that happen. I think it's pretty clear if you look at Spotify or Apple Music or any streaming service that there are trade-offs, that like there are just some music on these services that you can't get. You just have to have that music locally, especially if you have really obscure music. This is certainly true. Or sometimes deals fall through and some music you used to have access to just suddenly disappears. And so I think there's a very real trade-off to be had. That streaming really does have convenience to people, but at the same time, it also has drawbacks, which is not to say that everyone who uses streaming services is wrong, but I think that there will always be a certain segment of people who values those things that you have to trade off when you go to a streaming service. That is, if you have obscure music that you got from friends, this kind of use case isn't well supported and will never be well supported by a streaming service that's trying to cater to to the mainstream music listening appetite. So for that reason, I think that the second future for Beets that I'm excited about is trying to capture some of the advantages of streaming services while still maintaining the vision of owning your own music. And this means, like, for example, the idea of having music available on your phone, much more music available on your phone than you can actually possibly fit on your phone, for example, or having recommendations offered to you based on your listening habits. These are things that Spotify and Apple Music offer you, but aren't necessarily exclusive to Apple Music and Spotify. So I'm excited about a future for Beets where we can be a little bit more independent of our own machines. Well, for example, building streaming clients for Beets libraries that can stream across network and try to give you sort of a transparency of where your music files are exactly located, even if we maintain the vision for the kinds of people like me and other people who currently use Beets who really do want to have their hands on their music library and know that nobody else controls it.
And one of the other aspects of digital music that works to stymie people who want to have those large local libraries is the concept of DRM, which you mentioned. And nowadays it's becoming increasingly difficult to actually find anywhere to be able to purchase music in MP3 or other format and be able to actually download it and own that music unencumbered by DRM, whereas a lot of services you can purchase the music, but then the only way that you can download it is via their proprietary client, and so they still control the way that you're able to organize and access that music.
Yeah, that's a great point. It will at some point be harder and harder to get actual MP3s to play. We, at least for a long time, are going to always have the alternative to buy physical media and rip from there. But some point in the future, that's going to go away too. On the other hand, like, there are certain areas of the internet where this is certainly not changing. Like, if you look at bands whose music is on Bandcamp, for example, it's a really popular platform, and they let you stream music in the browser there, but you can also download things from Bandcamp. And this is also true, I notice, for a lot of the larger indie labels out there, that certainly you can stream their music through Spotify or Apple Music or anything, but they also offer online downloads of MP3s still. And especially for these fussier indie labels, they will even offer like really high quality lossless audio available on their website. So it strikes me that, like, for the moment at least, there's sort of a receding number of like really popular services that are trying to give you give you music for download, but it is sort of distributing out into smaller services, especially on the indie side of things, that where this is still sort of a core part of their business.
Yeah, and for artists who are either not necessarily aiming to gain mass distribution or who are early in their career, there's also sites like the Free Music Archive where they will upload their music generally with a Creative Commons license, so that it's easier for people to discover it and share it and not have to worry about issues associated with DRM.
Right.
And going back to Beets specifically, I'm wondering what you have found to be some of the most challenging aspects of building and maintaining it, whether from the technical or from the social aspects.
Great. I have an answer for both of those, actually. From the technical aspect, there's one thing that has been far and away the largest source of bugs in Beets, and that is Unicode file names. There's nothing else that has been more of a headache than that. As a tiny bit of background, I guess sometimes it feels like, even though Beets is supposed to be a music manager, it's sometimes a file manager, which means that like everything it deals with is file names. And so we need to be extremely careful and make sure we have an extremely robust way of keeping track of file names. And this means that we get exposed to vagaries in file names across operating systems that I feel like most software does not have to deal with. In particular, there are not very many operating systems that can actually store file names as Unicode. Most file systems actually, especially on all Unixes out there, store file names as a string of bytes, which means they can be arbitrary bytes, except for null bytes and a few other things. They can be any bytes you like, which means that if a operating system tells you my file names are encoded with a certain encoding, say they're encoded with UTF-8 or they're encoded with Latin 1 or any other string encoding, it might be lying to you. There always might be files out there whose string of bytes is not a UTF-8 string or is not a Latin 1 string, despite what the operating system told you. So there's a very real need to keep file names represented as bytes, even though you think of them as text, even though you'd like to think of them as Unicode if they have non-ASCII characters in them. But the trouble arises when users just sort of like expect that their file names are well formed, but they find out that they don't obey the encodings, which means that we, for example, whenever we like print a file name to the console, we have to be very careful about first doing our best to try to decode the file name using the file system's encoding reported by the operating system, even though it might be lying, and then trying to re-encode it into the console encoding. And again, the system might have a very limited encoding there. So we just have to do our best, and occasionally question marks absolutely have to show up in place of special characters in file names, just because of the way the user's system is configured. And this very much confuses users. And this in some ways, this has been one of the more difficult things about moving to Python 3 also, whereas in Python 2, file names were just strings of bytes. They were just blobs of bytes that you got from the operating system. In some ways, that was simpler than what Python 3 tries to do, which is tries to pretend that what you're getting are Unicode strings, but they in fact are representations of bytes that are pretending to be Unicode. They have certain sigils in them that represent undecodable bytes from the operating system, which adds another layer of complexity. So while I really loved moving to Python 3, there's lots of great features. I really like having Unicode everywhere except file names. This has actually been slightly more difficult in dealing with Python 3 than it was in Python 2. As far as the social aspect of things, I think that by far the most difficult thing for me has been managing my own time, the way I allocate my time to the project. When I started, I was in college and I had lots of free time for side projects. It didn't seem that way at the time, but looking back, it did. And since then, I've gone on a personal trajectory of having less and less time. I'm now an assistant professor in the computer science department at Cornell, which is a profession that is not known for giving you lots of time to pursue side projects, which means that it's basically all I can do to keep track of how the project is going and delegate work to other people who are involved in the project. But I myself can't invest huge amounts of time into adding new features. And that's been really challenging because I feel like a big ingredient in the success of Beets and any open source project is the attention of its creator.
Yeah, there's definitely the ongoing issue in open source of figuring out what is the succession plan for any given project and when should that plan be sort of defined and when should it be implemented, because as you said, there's always this sliding scale of how much attention can be afforded for a project that's not really providing any monetary remuneration. So yeah, it's a hard problem and one that the society at large is still trying to solve.
It certainly is. Yeah. And here's the thing is that there are so many people who use and enjoy developing Beets that like there really is a large workforce out there that's willing to contribute and to write code, which is wonderful, and they really are extremely helpful in managing the project. And it's only because of them that the project has continued to make progress when I've been able to spend less attention on it. But on the other hand, there's one thing that it's really hard to get external collaborators to do, which is to have a global view of the entire project. That it's a sort of like notice that a bug being filed over here and a bug being filed over here are actually connected, and that's extremely important to the health of a project. But it's super hard for anyone to do if they're just paying attention to a certain piece of the system. So that basically still falls to me, despite the amount of energy that's going on in individual pieces of Beets.
Yeah, being able to promote somebody from within the community is difficult because of that need for having the overarching vision for the project, because as you said, it's easy to identify there's an issue here, I can fix this issue, but how does this issue play into the overall direction that the project wants to be taken in, particularly given what you were saying about wanting to expand the scope of what Beets can be used for into this hybrid model of being able to stream to multiple devices and not just be responsible for managing files on a single machine.
Right, exactly.
Going a bit deeper on the technical side, one of the things that I've always been a little curious about in terms of managing audio files is how the acoustic fingerprinting comes into play for being able to identify a track within a service such as MusicBrainz and differentiate it from something else, even if the two files might be named the same thing and have the same file size, but they're actually two completely different pieces of music.
That's a great point. So what Beets uses for this, it has a plugin for a service that's called Acoustic, which uses a fingerprinting algorithm called Chroma print, which I did not develop. So I'm in awe of the original developer of Acoustic and Chroma print, because it's a piece of signal processing and computer science magic that I think is incredibly cool. But the rough idea, as I understand it, is that the acoustic fingerprinting tries to take a very long music file and reduce the dimensionality to a relatively short vector of values that can then be hashed in a way such that the hash of two similar vectors is relatively close, which means that you can build a database that's able to look up vectors that are kind of close in a certain space according to a certain distance metric and return those. So similar sounding files will get looked together. So this is actually a service that's run independently of MusicBrainz, and it relies on a lot of people analyzing their music collection, first tagging it with MusicBrainz so that every track has a MusicBrainz ID, and then also analyzing it with Acoustic ID, with Chroma print, and then uploading to the Acoustic server both the fingerprint and the MusicBrainz ID. And then that server's job, the Acoustic server's job, is just to associate a similar cluster of Chroma print fingerprints with a MusicBrainz ID. And this, just because a lot of people have volunteered their music libraries and their computing power to do this, has built up an extremely large catalog of these fingerprints. So most music can be identified this way. It's on the MusicBrainz service. It's really quite remarkable. But another thing that I think is interesting is that most of the time, Beets doesn't actually need fingerprints to do matching. This is an optional feature, and it turns out that metadata-based matching, where even if you have really bad titles and artists and album names on your music, it turns out it's pretty easy to using fuzzy string matching to try to guess what album you have. And so it only turns out to be necessary to use this incredible fingerprinting technology when you have like extremely bad or totally missing metadata. So it's nice to be able to turn that off and rely on incomplete metadata at first.
Yeah, I imagine that drastically speeds up the overall processing time for a first pass through a music library by not having to do that computational intensive work of creating that fingerprint and matching it against the database.
Absolutely. Yes. Right. So my general recommendation, and I put this in the documentation too, is that people, if they try to use Beets, they try analyzing their music. Even if it seems crazy, they try analyzing their music without fingerprinting first, because it is extremely expensive to turn that on. And then only if they run into trouble, then turn on fingerprinting.
And when I was doing some of the research to get ready for this conversation, I noticed that there are a number of other projects that use Beets as one of the components of the library management, and most of these are more GUI oriented. So I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about some of the more interesting use cases for Beets that you have seen beyond just the typical workflow of using it via the command line.
That's a good question. So, actually not terribly aware of what people are doing with GUIs to Beets. There's a few of them that I think are really cool. Like someone recently showed me like an Android single-page web app thing that interacted with Beets over the network that I thought was really neat. But just because for my own personal use, I am so invested in just interacting with it through the command line. I'm actually not terribly aware of all the GUIs that people have created. Out of curiosity, what was the one that you saw that was the most popular?
I don't remember specifically what the projects were. I just know that when I was searching around for information about Beets, that there were a few links that appeared to use Beets as one of the components of a larger overall project.
Oh, cool. Yeah, right. I think my favorite example of this is there's a handful of these streaming-oriented things that use Beets' built-in web server plugin. They're able to connect to that over a network and then display an interface. In the general category of like cool things I've seen done with Beets, one really weird thing that someone did a while back was to build a virtual file system to interact with your music, which meant that you could keep your files physically on disk in one organization and like view them separately in a different in a virtual file system under a different organization. So you get to like you could, for example, organize your music both by artist and by album title, say, and in one giant directory listed by the title of the track. And you wouldn't have 3 copies of your music; those would just be virtual views onto the same underlying storage. I thought that was really ridiculous, but also really cool. This is not particularly technical, but another really cool use of Beets that I heard about was when a college radio station was using Beets to organize their music collection for playing on the radio, which seems like a perfect use case because you have a totally massive collection of music for a radio station and need to call up individual tracks really quickly.
Both of those definitely sound very useful. I can particularly see with the virtual file system the appeal of being able to slice into your music library along those different dimensions without having to shuffle all the files around to actually do those changes. Because one of the systems that I use for my music is I have a network file store that uses the universal plug and play or DLNA server for being able to view the music via the various metadata and sort it by artist or by album or by genre. And so being able to do something similar at the file system level using Beets, I can see as being very useful.
Yeah, totally.
And along those lines too, I'm wondering if there are any other projects that you're aware of for managing your music library that you see as being similar in direction to Beets and how the Beets project compares to them as far as functionality or capabilities.
Good question. So I think the closest project that's worth mentioning, which is also a Python project, is the MusicBrainz Picard tagger. MusicBrainz has this open source tagger it's really great. It's been around for a really long time. It's a Qt based GUI for tagging your music. It's kind of like the flagship tagging tool for the MusicBrainz database, and it works really well. I think that the main differences with Beets are obviously that it's a GUI app instead of a command line program. But I think that the main architectural difference is that Beets actually tries to catalog your music. It's sort of a library manager in addition to just a tagger, whereas you can kind of use Picard as a library manager, but it really wants to just tag your music, move it around, and call it done. And I think that also as a result of being command line oriented, I think Beets has a greater focus on being automated, whereas Picard really wants you to be involved in, for example, grouping together your music from flat files into albums and then tagging those albums and then moving them. Each of those is a separate step you kind of need to interact with. In Beets, we try to automate everything except for the actual decisions of what happens to your music, and we just ask you for consent instead of having you take direct action to move your music around. I think that the original, the closest comparison to like Beets as a music manager is actually iTunes still, which is a piece of software that literally no one likes anymore. But it used to be kind of the best tool that there was out there for like keeping your music organized in a consistent file system structure. And well, nobody really likes using iTunes. I still see it as a sort of inspiration for having like a catalog of your music that where the tool owns a directory and keeps track of all your music within that directory and is responsible for the files, and you don't move around the files yourself. You give over control to a higher level database.
And you mentioned that one of the overall design features that you're interested in is that hybrid approach for bringing Beets more into the streaming era. But are there any other features or new functionality that you have planned for the future of Beets or that you would like to see contributed by users of the project?
Sure. Yeah. Well, one thing that I think is relatively near term is that some people got around to contributing a kind of overhaul to the command line interface, to what the terminal interface looks like to the importer to Beets. It's sort of its main user-facing feature where it walks through your music and tries to tag it. It is, because it's gained so much information over the years, it's kind of visually cluttered and confusing. And some people have proposed a great set of changes, and have actually started implementing a great set of changes to redesign how it looks in the terminal. So that things are sort of more logically laid out and easier to navigate. And this project is about halfway done, and I would really appreciate anyone's help bringing that to completion. As far as toward the grander vision of streaming and like multi-device systems, the direction that I could really use some help with is this effort that I started a while back to define a protocol for interacting with your music. You mentioned DLNA or UPnP a little bit ago. The essential idea behind this new protocol is something that fulfills a similar role to something like that, like is a way for clients to talk to servers that control music libraries, but should be more extensible by Beets and Beets-like tools for communicating between where your music lives and where you want to play it. And that project is called ARA. It stands for the ARA Universal REST API, I think. It's sort of a backronym. But the idea is to define an API that will be in common between Beets and other projects that need to manage your music in different ways. I would love to have help fleshing out that API and building clients and servers and intermediate utilities for moving music across the network.
And are there any other aspects of the Beets project or media management or music libraries in general that we didn't discuss yet that you think we should talk about?
Nothing comes to mind. I think we covered basically everything.
So for anybody who wants to follow the work that you're up to and get in touch, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And so with that, I'll move us on into the picks. And since this conversation has been so heavily focused towards music and everything that goes along with it, I'm going to choose a few different musical groups and pieces of music. And so the first is Mozart's Requiem, which is an excellent classical piece that's very well written, well performed, very atmospheric and powerful, and I've enjoyed it for a long time. So if you have not taken the time to listen to a performance of it, whether recorded or otherwise, I definitely suggest that you do that. And moving in a different direction, another group that I've enjoyed for a long time is Government Mule, led by Warren Haynes, who has been making music for quite a long time, and Government Mule has been touring and recording for well over a decade. I don't even know how long they've been at it, but they do some great music. And then taking it in yet a third direction, another group that I enjoy is Darkest Hour, which is more hardcore metal, but very technical and well executed. So yeah, I'm just going to leave it with that. And if you have any picks for us this week, Adrian?
Great. Yes, I also have a thematic pick, but it's a little roundabout. If I were to reference the kitchen appliance called a spiralizer. Have you ever heard of this?
I have, and I have one in my kitchen, actually.
Great. Okay, so my recommendation is spiralizing beets, the vegetable. A spiralizer, for the uninitiated, is something that takes a vegetable and kind of spins it around on like a series of knives and turns it into sort of long noodle-like things. And you can spiralize all manner of vegetables. You get like an entertaining and yet gluten-free, like pasta-like substance. I'm not gluten-free myself, but I still think it's a pretty cool thing to do. And I think that probably the most popular thing to spiralize is summer squash, is zucchini. But spiralizing beets can be just as good or better if you like beets at all, or even if you don't like beets. I totally recommend trying it. So my pick is to spiralize your beets, to turn them into beet noodles, and then cover them in pesto. Pesto spiralized beets are my pick.
That sounds delicious. Yeah, my children are very fond of spiralized carrots. That was one of the ways that we got them to actually start eating them.
Perfect.
All right. Well, thank you for taking the time to join me today and talk about the work that you've done on Beets. It's a very interesting project and one that I'm going to have to unleash on my music library to bring it back to some semblance of organization. It's been years in the making, so hopefully that'll speed things along. So thank you for that, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Great. It was a real pleasure, and enjoy using Beets if you do. And please ask lots of questions on IRC.